So, how is Dragon Age the Veilguard doing in terms of sales, and possibly in terms of its future at BioWare and BioWare in turn's future with Electronic Arts and as a video game developer? And perhaps even more importantly, why should anyone even care? See, this is one of those interesting little aspects of our currently ongoing culture war, where products become, how do I put it, almost like battlegrounds. Not even so much as in they are being fought over, nobody's trying to claim Dragon Age Veilguard, but rather to use them as examples of the correctness of their own position, being able to call whether or not something is going to be a hit or a miss before the game even releases, and then of course explaining why that was the case. See, I remember back in the day, there was often surrounding the conversation around Total War, Creative Assembly's flagship title, where if you critiqued it, people would come out of the woodwork and say, "Why do you want Total War to fail?" And nobody actually wanted Total War to fail. They wanted better Total War, and Creative Assembly had made it very apparent that the only thing they listened to was stick. Usually delivered quite vociferously as well. A position they have clung to steadfastly, and well, wider gaming is the same. You get the industry that you deserve with your silence. See Horse Armor DLC, and how what was once met as a joke, unfortunately, is not only commonplace anymore, but it has gotten so much worse, to the point that we long for Horse Armor DLC. But, okay then, Dragon Age Veilguard has become one of these recent battlegrounds, where, well, my side, broadly speaking, has looked at it and don't really see this becoming a success, and having played it, I hate it. It is not a very good video game. The combat is barely acceptable if it was simply just a third-person action RPG, which it is not. It is supposed to be Dragon Age, goddammit. It is supposed to be party-based combat. It is supposed to have good characters and interesting story, and these character companions are awful, and the story too is confused, weird, and disjointed. It genuinely feels when you're beginning the game as if you missed out on like a couple hours of prologue at least, but we won't go too much into that here. Let's then begin answering the question. So, Dragon Age the Veilguard surprises everyone as EA's biggest single-player launch on Steam. Wowzers Bowsers. Clearly the game is doing really well, except hold on there. Usually when an outlet like Kotaku, on the more progressive side of things, feel the urge to write a very long title like this with very specific note here, biggest single-player launch on Steam. I see. Okay. How many single-player games have been launched by EA on Steam? Apex Legends? No. Battlefield? No. EA Sports? No. FIFA? No. Sims, you could kind of argue, but not really. And if that was, well then, it would be bigger. Need for Speed Heat? No. There's Dragon Age Veilguard. Alright, and there's our first actual single-player game, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which peaked out at about 10,000 or so or less players. Are there any other? Oh, Dead Space, there you go, there's another single-player game. The Dead Space remake. The point is, there's not a whole lot of single-player EA games released on Steam, so that is somewhat hollow praise. And to be fair, Dragon Age the Veilguard is not doing super-duper poorly. This isn't another Concord or a Dustborn by any stretch of the imagination. Let me update that real quick to see if there's been anything. So the 24-hour peak has now gone on to 77,000. So it has gone up a little bit from the previous peak of about 70,000 players yesterday. And now as the weekend will start setting in, this is likely to increase. We are probably going to see a peak of maybe 80,000 possibly, as it hasn't gone up by all that much. And I'm imagining the player numbers are beginning to fall off by now, but it might even go as high as 90 or even 100,000, which would probably indicate a pretty damn solid success. Now, what can we compare this with? Well, Mass Effect Legends, I guess, Legendary Edition, that he peaked out at 60,000 players, which is pretty damn good for a re-release of a bunch of old games. That is, of course, also a BioWare product, and again, with ancient-ass games having competitive player numbers, it's not a fantastic indicator. Jedi Survivor, 67,000, so now 10,000 less. Again, Jedi Survivor, Star Wars franchise, despite all of its beatings, is still a fairly significant one, but it's not necessarily the greatest comparison. We could bring it up against, other big RPGs like Baldur's Gate and... well, that's not a very favorable comparison, but that's also Larian Studios and Baldur's Gate. Now, I would actually argue that BioWare should be an even more prestigious name, and Dragon Age, whilst not being as big of a franchise as Baldur's Gate, well, both of them... Baldur's Gate was largely resurged by 3, really honestly, and Dragon Age was at least a major franchise until they couldn't stop shitting on it, so... it is always difficult to compare these games, but let's then add in a couple of data points, shall we? Firstly, the high sales numbers, relatively speaking, are probably due to 2 factors. 1, the game is literally being given away for free, remember that? We covered this a while ago. Many of those copies are probably not actually bought copies. Now, how many? God only knows. It's probably not that many, because, how many people are really using GeForce now, I suppose. I also saw suggestions that they were giving away the game on Twitch, but I haven't been able to confirm that, so, But the biggest factor was probably this. The massively positive amount of mainstream media reviews, where basically it did not get a negative word spoken about it. All of the mainstream media were in absolute unison that this was going to be an amazing game, and here is where the culture war nonsense comes in yet again, as this, of course, is very much so the opposition, shall we say. They have as much to gain from declaring Dragon Age Veilguard a resounding success as we have, quote-unquote, to gain from declaring it a failure, and BioWare certainly did massage these numbers quite heavily. There have been various allegations of heavy-handed review restrictions, as well as we know this for a fact, that BioWare not only reportedly, but we now have multiple reports from people who were given access to earlier versions of Veilguard being refused review copies because they were a bit more critical than the others. So, again, already, BioWare has certainly massaged the reviews to have the greatest positive PR spin on the game preceding its launch, and of course that's smart. Now, let's then think numbers for a second, shall we? So, 77,000 hour peak. Okay, let's say 70,000 people in sales, right? And then let's triple that for safety's sake. We're looking at like 210,000. We'll make it a nice sort of pseudo-ish round number at 250,000, shall we? $250,000 sales. Okay, $60 a pop. That's about what? $15 million? Not bad. Of course, you're going to have to take into consideration that some of those are free, and that Steam is going to be taking a 30% cut of those sales as well, so the actual income to BioWare is going to be significantly lesser. But for the sake of conversation here, let's assume $15 million in sales, alright? That's over the course of the first launch day and weekend. Alright, this game has been in development for about, 8 to maybe even possibly 10 years at this point? It's probably going to have cost BioWare a solid 100 million at least, probably 150, and if you're looking at Concords, 200 to 300. Now, bear you in mind, that also, the 300 number, included the cost of the purchasing the IP and the studio, so I think 100 to 150 million is probably a reasonable estimate. In other words, the game is nowhere even remotely close to receiving, just even paying back its actual investment, never mind making a profit. Now, these numbers might very well go up, but I have a doubt on that, so this is an interesting little idea here. So 43.5% of players, so less than half of players, have gotten through part 1, the Mintharas job, which is in essence the tutorial section. So less than half of people have gotten through the first hour or so of the game, the de facto tutorial. That's not very good. That's not very good at all. That suggests a very high degree of fallout. And bear in mind, there is no exploration in this game either. There's no opportunity to get lost or wander off or do something else. The entire game is one long linear RPG. And bear in mind, there's nothing necessarily wrong with a linear RPG either. In fact, I wish that Inquisition had been a far more linear RPG, but it's just to say that people aren't getting lost in this game or anything like that. But perhaps the most persuasive data point we have as to whether or not Dragon Age the Veilguard is a failure, beyond the currently ongoing player numbers, beyond the fact that there seems to be some ridiculous fall-off, beyond the positive reviews, is the comments of BioWare themselves. So, this here was released on the 31st, so same as launch day at Rolling Stones. Dragon Age the Veilguard is BioWare's best game in ages. Well, I mean, considering how long it's been since they made a video game, that's actually fairly correct. But the interesting part here comes down here. So, we have been doing Dragon Age pre-production on versions of Dragon Age 4, and we did have a version that was a lot more open world, that's what it says. But again, we ran some problems on how to make it compelling or narratively interesting. So, again, they've already made one game pretty much already, and then they scrapped it and remade it. That explains the long-ass development time. That also will give you a very big and important data point as to how expensive the game has been. And then this part here. With Dragon Age the Veilguard now complete, BioWare confirms that there are currently no plans for downloadable expansions. The developer's full attention has now shifted entirely to the next Mass Effect as their current project. This is the biggest indicator of all that the game is almost certainly not a financial success. In this day and age, there is nothing that is getting released without a content support plan. There is nothing that isn't being released without some sort of cosmetic DLC at least, story expansions or additives. This is the norm these days. All of these games are intended to be in essence live service projects, or at the very least something to be built upon to continue to see an income from the initial investment. The very fact that Veilguard has none of this planned shows us very clearly that BioWare at least is washing their hands of the product. They do not believe this will be a financial success worth doubling down on. They do not believe that this is something that they will be worthwhile to develop further. They had the game, they'd worked on it for 8 years, they needed to get it out the door and recoup some of their losses, is how I am reading this. But they are not going to continue to reinforce failure, which is, of course, again, wise. Now, what I do think is, with the, in my opinion, fairly actually surprisingly solid sales numbers that we can see indicated here, Dragon Age is not going to be killing BioWare. They are going to have, at the very least, an opportunity to release Mass Effect, as EA is likely to be looking at numbers like these and be rather disappointed with their 8-year-long investment, but is probably going to provide BioWare with enough for-the-moment capital to complete the production of their next game. And as they have also already vociferously stated that it will not be a Mass Effect like Dragon Age the Veilguard, that they will instead be going in a very different direction, that also, I believe, is an indicator that they themselves understood that what they had on their hands here was not a success of anywhere near the magnitude they required, and so they are going to be going for a more core audience experience in the upcoming Mass Effect. Now, of course, we don't know for that for sure yet, and we won't for quite some time, but that would be my general read on the situation here. BioWare clearly does not have any great faith in the Veilguard being a worthwhile investment. They are not going to reinforce it, and they are not going to bank upon it being a long-term success, which jives very well with the massive fall-off in players here. So, final conclusion then, has Dragon Age the Veilguard been a hit or a flop? I don't think it has been either. Has it been a worthwhile investment? Probably not. Does BioWare recognize that? It appears so. Has it sold better than I had anticipated? Absolutely yes. I would have figured the game would probably have peaked at 40, 30,000 maybe, from what I'd seen early on, and the massively overwhelming negative reaction to the game online. But the blitz of positive PR has benefited the game enormously, as well as a stranglehold on the opinions of the reviewers, with those who were actually given review codes for it. All of them tend to be rather wishy-washy. I haven't seen a lot of it because I don't watch a whole lot of YouTube these days, to be honest, but it is very clear to me, at least, that the majority of people who did receive review keys understand now that if they are hoping to get any other review keys out of BioWare, they'd better moderate their opinions, shall we say. So, Dragon Age the Veilguard, not a hit, certainly not the massive hit the company required after 8 years of production, but not a complete failure either. At the very least, not for the moment. Bearing in mind as well, it is a single-player RPG, so even if you see massive player falloffs like next week, for example, that too may not necessarily be an indicator of failure. I think this is probably the most relevant numbers that we are going to have, and then over the weekend. That, anyways, would be my assessment of the situation. Do let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.